Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. Deep in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, where ancient ridges cast long shadows and the wind carries whispers of forgotten secrets, there exists a story that has haunted local residents for over a century. It's a tale that begins on a bitter February night in 1887, when an entire family simply disappeared. But the Holloway case is more than just one family's mysterious fate. It's a doorway into a pattern of vanishings that suggests something far more sinister lurking in these ancient hills. The last confirmed sighting of the Holloway family was on February 14th, Valentine's Day, though there would be nothing romantic about what was to unfold. Ezra Holloway had been seen chopping wood behind his modest log cabin, his breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air. His wife, Margaret, was spotted hanging laundry on the line, despite the threatening gray clouds that promised snow. Their 3 children, 12-year-old Samuel, 8-year-old Mary, and little Thomas, barely 5, had been playing in the yard, their laughter echoing through the hollow. By morning, they were gone. But as we'll discover, they would not be the last. The Ozark Mountains in February of 1887 were an unforgiving place, a landscape carved by geological forces that had shaped these hills for millions of years. The region stretched across parts of Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Kansas, over 47,000 square miles of rugged terrain that had earned a reputation as one of America's most isolated and mysterious frontiers. Snow blanketed the rocky ridges and deep hollows, turning familiar paths into treacherous passages where a single misstep could send a traveler plunging into hidden ravines or underground caverns. The nearest neighbor to the Holloways lived 3 miles away through dense forest, and the closest town was a day's hard ride on horseback over mountain trails that could become impassable without warning. In this isolation, families learned to be self-sufficient, to weather storms both literal and metaphorical on their own. They developed their own laws, their own justice, and their own explanations for things that defied understanding. The mountains themselves seemed to breed superstition, with their maze-like geography creating pockets of perpetual shadow where strange sounds echoed and unexplained lights danced between the trees. But when Jacob Morrison rode up to the Holloway cabin on February 16th, drawn by the unusual silence and the sight of uncollected milk buckets, he discovered something that would chill him to his very bones. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the mountain breeze, like a mouth trying to speak words it could never utter. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, though inside the hearth still held warm embers that glowed with an unnatural persistence. The scene that greeted Morrison was one of eerie normalcy frozen in time, as if the family had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. On the kitchen table sat a half-prepared meal, potatoes peeled and waiting in a wooden bowl, a knife resting beside them with bits of skin still clinging to the blade. Margaret's sewing basket remained open, a child's torn shirt draped across her chair, where she had apparently been mending it when something interrupted her work. Ezra's tobacco pouch sat on the mantel, still warm to the touch, as if he had just set it down moments before. Most unsettling of all, the children's beds were neatly made, their few precious toys arranged carefully on the shelves. Samuel's carved wooden horse, Mary's corn-husk doll, little Thomas's collection of smooth river stones that he treasured above all other possessions. Morrison called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms, but received no answer except the whisper of wind through the gaps in the log walls. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, but something deeper and more profound, a silence that seemed to have weight and presence, as if it were actively listening and waiting for something to break its hold over the abandoned homestead. The Holloway family had not been strangers to hardship, but they were far from the mysterious figures that local folklore would later make them out to be. Ezra Holloway, 34 years old and weathered by sun and hard work, had moved his family to the remote hollow in the spring of 1885, purchasing 40 acres of rough mountain land from a trader who was eager to be rid of it. The deed, filed in the county courthouse, listed the price as $60 and a mule, a fortune for land that most considered worthless. He was a man of few words, but strong convictions, a veteran of the Civil War who had served with the 3rd Arkansas Infantry Regiment under Confederate General Sterling Price. Like many soldiers who survived that terrible conflict, Ezra carried the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much death and learned to value the simple peace of ordinary days. His military records, discovered years later in a dusty archive, showed that he had been wounded twice, once at the Battle of Prairie Grove and again during the retreat from Little Rock. Margaret, his wife of 15 years, had been born Margaret Elizabeth Crane in a small farming community near Batesville, Arkansas. She was known throughout the scattered mountain settlements for her skill with herbs and healing, possessing knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to work with what the land provided. Women would travel for days to seek her remedies for everything from difficult births to persistent fevers, bringing payment in the form of chickens, vegetables, or hand-woven cloth. Her reputation extended beyond mere herbcraft. Margaret possessed what mountain folk called the sight, an intuitive understanding of illness that went beyond book learning. She could diagnose problems that baffled visiting doctors from the lowland towns, and her treatments, while unconventional by medical standards of the day, showed remarkable success rates. Some whispered that her abilities bordered on the supernatural, a suggestion that would take on darker implications after her disappearance. Young Samuel was already showing signs of his father's stoic nature, shouldering responsibilities that would have challenged boys twice his age. He could handle an axe with the skill of a grown man, split kindling with mathematical precision, and track wounded game through terrain that confused experienced hunters. His teacher at the one-room schoolhouse 5 miles away described him as exceptionally bright but withdrawn, preferring the company of books to other children. Mary, spirited and curious despite the harsh realities of mountain life, had inherited her mother's gift for finding beauty in unlikely places. She possessed an almost mystical connection to the natural world, often returning home with pockets full of interesting stones, pressed flowers, or small creatures that she would nurse back to health before releasing them. Her laughter was said to be so infectious that even the grumpies, neighbors would smile when they heard it echoing through the hollow on warm summer evenings. Little Thomas, at barely 5 years old, was the light of the family. His infectious giggle and boundless curiosity brought joy to even the hardest days of mountain survival. He had a peculiar talent for finding lost objects and an uncanny ability to predict weather changes hours before they occurred. Margaret often said that Thomas seemed to understand the language of the mountains themselves, pausing in his play to listen to sounds that only he could hear. The family kept to themselves, not out of unfriendliness, but from the necessity of survival in such an isolated place. Neighbors described them as hard-working and honest, though some noted a certain wariness in Ezra's eyes, as if he were always listening for something approaching through the trees. Margaret, too, seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings, often pausing in her work to scan the tree line with an expression of quiet concern that suggested she sensed dangers invisible to others. To understand the full weight of the Holloway disappearance, one must first grasp the brutal reality of life in the Ozark Mountains during the 1880s. This was a land where nature ruled with an iron fist, where a single mistake could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire family. The mountains themselves seemed to possess a malevolent consciousness, with their maze-like hollows, sudden drop-offs, and caves that descended into impenetrable darkness. The geological history of the region added to its ominous character. The Ozarks are among the oldest mountain ranges in North America, formed by volcanic activity and tectonic upheaval that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago. Unlike younger mountain ranges with their sharp peaks and clearly defined ridges, the Ozarks had been worn down by eons of erosion into a complex landscape of rounded hills, deep valleys, and undergrowth, on river systems that created a honeycomb of caves and sinkholes. This ancient landscape was riddled with karst formations, areas where limestone bedrock had been dissolved by groundwater, creating vast underground chambers, sudden collapses, and springs that appeared and disappeared without warning. A person could walk across what appeared to be solid ground only to have it give way beneath their feet, plunging them into hidden caverns from which escape might be impossible. The winter of 1886 to 87 had been particularly harsh throughout the region. Weather records from that period, preserved in the archives of the National Weather Service, show temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero, the coldest recorded in the area's history. Snow fell in drifts higher than a man's head, and ice storms brought down massive trees that blocked trails for months at a time. Families had been forced to slaughter their livestock early, smoking and preserving what meat they could while watching their stores of grain and preserved vegetables dwindle with alarming speed. The Holloways, like their neighbors, had prepared for winter with the thoroughness that came from knowing that survival depended entirely on their own resources. Their root cellar, carved into the hillside behind the cabin, contained barrels of salted pork, sacks of cornmeal, preserved vegetables, and jars of honey that would normally last until spring planting. Yet when searchers examined the cellar after the family's disappearance, they found something puzzling. The food stores were largely intact, but arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate organization rather than normal use. Jars had been moved and grouped according to some system that made no apparent sense. Medicinal herbs separated from food items, containers arranged in geometric patterns, and certain supplies moved to positions where hay would be immediately visible to anyone entering the cellar. In such harsh conditions, the mountain folk developed their own unique culture, part practical survival, part inherited superstition. They spoke in hushed tones of painters, mountain lions that could snatch a full-grown man and drag him into the darkness without leaving a trace. They told stories of Cherokee spirits still roaming the ridges, angry at being driven from their ancestral lands during the forced removals of the 1830s. The Cherokee connection to the Ozarks ran deeper than most white settlers realized or cared to acknowledge. Archaeological evidence suggested that Native American peoples had inhabited these mountains for thousands of years, leaving behind burial mounds, petroglyphs, and sacred sites that dotted the landscape. Many of these sites had been disturbed or destroyed by homesteaders clearing land for farming, actions that the remaining Cherokee population viewed as sacrilege, deserving of supernatural retribution. Local Cherokee descendants, when asked about the Holloway disappearance years later, would nod knowingly and speak of places where the veil between worlds grew thin, areas where those who violated ancient taboos might find themselves pulled into realms from which there was no return. They told of spirit paths that crisscrossed the mountains, invisible highways used by the dead and other supernatural entities, and warned that living humans who accidentally stepped onto these paths might be swept away to unknown destinations. But the mountain folk also whispered of darker things that had nothing to do with Cherokee legends. They spoke of witches who could curse crops and livestock, causing them to sicken and die without apparent cause. They told stories of creatures that walked on two legs but were not quite human, things that mimicked human voices to lure travelers into the deep woods, shapeshifters that could appear as trusted friends or family members before revealing their true predatory nature. Most disturbing of all were the tales of places in the deep woods where compasses spun wildly and even experienced hunters became hopelessly lost. These areas, known locally as bewildered lands, seemed to exist outside the normal rules of geography and physics. People who entered them reported finding the same landmarks repeatedly despite walking in straight lines, discovering paths that led uphill in all directions, and encountering clearings where the sun cast shadows in impossible directions. The folklore of the region was deeply intertwined with its harsh realities. Families that ventured too far into certain hollows were said to vanish completely, their cabins found months later with cold hearths and empty rooms. Some attributed these disappearances to natural causes, flash floods that could sweep away entire homesteads in minutes, cave-ins that swallowed buildings whole, attacks by the massive black bears that roamed the deeper wilderness. Others insisted that supernatural forces were at work, that the mountains themselves were hungry entities that demanded tribute from those who dared to make their homes in such forbidden places. They pointed to the unusually high number of disappearances in the region, the frequency of strange phenomena reported by travelers, and the reluctance of even hardened frontiersmen to venture into certain areas after dark. It was into this world of practical hardship and supernatural dread that the Holloway mystery would be born, a case that would blur the lines between documented fact and mountain legend until the truth became as elusive as morning mist rising from the valleys. The discovery of the empty Holloway cabin sent shockwaves through the scattered mountain community, but it also triggered a response that revealed just how prepared these isolated folk were for such emergencies. Within hours of Jacob Morrison's initial discovery, a network of riders had spread the word to every homestead within a 20-mile radius. This communication system, developed over decades of frontier living, could relay urgent messages across vast distances faster than any official postal service. By evening of February 16th, more than 30 men had gathered at the Holloway homestead, their faces grim as they examined the scene by lantern light. These were not casual volunteers, but experienced woodsmen who understood the dangers of the mountains and the urgency of acting quickly when lives were at stake. They had responded to similar emergencies before: children lost in blizzards, hunters who failed to return from extended trips, families cut off by flash floods or avalanches. What they found at the Holloway cabin defied their collective experience. The scene showed no signs of struggle or violence, no furniture overturned, no blood staining the rough wooden floors. The family's few valuable possessions, Ezra's rifle, a .44 caliber Springfield that had seen service during the war, Margaret's mother's silver locket engraved with roses, a small jar containing gold coins hidden behind a loose floorboard, remained untouched and in plain sight. Even more puzzling was the condition of the livestock. The family's 2 milk cows, 3 pigs, and flock of chickens were alive but clearly distressed, having gone without food or water for at least 2 days. The animals showed signs of extreme agitation, huddling together in corners of their enclosures and refusing to venture into the open areas of the barnyard. Most disturbing of all, they seemed reluctant to approach the cabin itself, as if some invisible barrier prevented them from coming too close to the building where their owners had vanished. Samuel Jenkins, a tracker with decades of experience in the mountains, examined the ground around the cabin with growing bewilderment. His reputation for reading signs in the wilderness was legendary. He could tell the age, sex, and physical condition of a person from footprints that were nearly invisible to others, track wounded animals through terrain that showed no obvious trace of their passage, and predict weather changes days in advance by observing subtle signs in animal behavior. But the tracks around the Holloway cabin made no sense. The snow had been disturbed in several places, creating patterns that seemed to follow no logical sequence. There were footprints leading away from the cabin in multiple directions, some appearing to be made by bare feet, despite the freezing temperatures that would have caused frostbite within minutes. Most disturbing of all, many of the tracks seemed to simply stop, not fade away as they might in wind-blown snow, but end abruptly, as if their makers had simply vanished into thin air. Jenkins spent hours studying these mysterious tracks, measuring their depth and spacing, analyzing the gait patterns and direction of travel. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about tracking. Some prints showed signs of being made by children, but with stride lengths that suggested superhuman speed. Others appeared to have been made by adults walking backward, but with perfect precision that would have been impossible in the dark over rough terrain. Most puzzling of all were tracks that seemed to have been pressed into the snow from above, as if their makers had descended from the sky rather than walking across the ground. These prints showed none of the characteristics of normal footprints. No scuff marks from forward motion, no deeper impressions at heel or toe. No sign of the slight wobble that occurs with each step. They appeared to have been placed rather than made, each one identical to the others in depth and clarity. Inside the cabin, closer examination revealed additional anomalies that seemed to mock attempts at rational analysis. Margaret's winter coat hung on its peg by the door, along with the children's heavy woolen cloaks that had been gifts from their grandmother in Little Rock. Ezra's boots sat neatly beside the hearth, still bearing mud from his last trip to the woodshed. How had the family left the cabin on a freezing February night without their warm clothing or proper footwear? The condition of the evening meal provided another puzzle. The potatoes Margaret had been preparing showed no signs of browning or decay, despite having been cut hours or even days earlier. Fresh-cut potatoes normally begin to discolor within minutes of exposure to air, but these remained as white and firm as if they had just been peeled. The knife used to cut them showed similar anomalies. No starch residue on the blade, no moisture that should have remained from the cutting process. Even more unsettling was the persistence of the fire in the hearth. The embers should have burned out completely within hours of the family's departure, yet they continued to glow with soft red light that provided neither heat nor the ability to ignite fresh wood. When investigators tried to stir the coals or add fuel to restart the fire, the embers seemed to resist their efforts, maintaining their mysterious glow regardless of outside interference. The family Bible, normally kept on the mantel in a place of honor, had been moved to the kitchen table and opened to specific passages that would later be seen as prophetic. The book lay open to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verses describing the end times. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Someone had underlined these verses in fresh ink, though no pen or ink bottle could be found anywhere in the cabin. The handwriting appeared to match Margaret's careful script, but family members who later examined the markings insisted that she would never have written in the sacred book. The Holloways were devout Christians who treated their Bible with reverence, bordering on worship, handling it only with clean hands and storing it safely away from the daily activities of household life. As news of the disappearance spread beyond the immediate area, it began to attract attention from law enforcement officials who normally had little involvement in mountain affairs. Sheriff William Bradshaw, a former federal marshal with experience investigating crimes on the frontier, rode out from the county seat to examine the scene personally. What he found challenged his understanding of criminal behavior and forced him to consider possibilities that his training had never prepared him to handle. Bradshaw's official report, filed with the county clerk and preserved in courthouse archives, provides a fascinating glimpse into late 19th century investigative methods. His examination of the cabin revealed several details that the initial searchers had missed or dismissed as unimportant. The door frame showed fresh scratches that appeared to have been made from the inside, as if someone had clawed desperately at the wood while trying to escape. Yet the door itself had been found standing open, with no sign that it had been forced or damaged. More mysteriously, Bradshaw discovered what appeared to be scorch marks on the wooden floor in several locations, forming patterns that resembled no known burn source. The marks were perfectly circular, approximately 6 inches in diameter, and penetrated deep into the hardwood planking. Yet there was no evidence of fire damage to surrounding areas, no smell of smoke or charcoal, and no explanation for how such precise burns could have been created in a cabin built entirely of flammable materials. The investigation that followed would prove to be as mysterious as the disappearance itself. In 1887, law enforcement in the remote regions of the Ozark Mountains was a patchwork affair at best, hampered by poor communication, vast distances, and the independent nature of mountain folk who preferred to handle their own problems without outside interference. Bradshaw organized the most systematic search effort the region had ever seen, deploying teams of volunteers in grid patterns that covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness. He brought in bloodhounds from Little Rock, hoping that the dog's superior tracking abilities might reveal clues that human searchers had missed. He even arranged for telegraph messages to be sent to law enforcement agencies throughout Arkansas and neighboring states, alerting them to watch for any sign of the missing family. But the search efforts were hampered from the beginning by the same mysterious phenomena that had characterized the disappearance itself. The bloodhounds, normally reliable in tracking human scent through the most challenging terrain, became confused and agitated when brought to the Holloway property. Instead of following a clear trail away from the cabin, they ran in circles, whining and pawing at the ground as if they were detecting scents from multiple directions simultaneously. Weather conditions added to the investigated. Orse's challenges. The winter of 1887 produced several more severe storms that covered any remaining tracks with fresh snow and ice. Temperature fluctuations created freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed evidence and made travel through the mountains increasingly dangerous. Several search parties had to be rescued after becoming lost in terrain that local guides had considered familiar and safe. Despite these obstacles, the searchers did uncover some intriguing clues. 3 miles from the cabin, they discovered what appeared to be a temporary campsite in a small clearing beside Mulberry Creek. The remains of a fire pit contained ashes that seemed too fresh for the harsh winter weather, and the ground showed signs of recent habitation. Areas where snow had been cleared away, branches arranged as seating, and rocks positioned to reflect heat from a fire. The campsite raised more questions than it answered. If the Holloways had fled their home and camped here, why had they left no clear trail to follow? The site was located in a direction that made no strategic sense, not toward the nearest town or neighboring homestead, but deeper into the wilderness where survival would become increasingly difficult. And why abandon a relatively sheltered spot for the even more dangerous terrain that lay beyond? Analysis of the fire pit revealed additional mysteries. The ashes contained fragments of burned material that included cloth fibers matching the Holloway family's clothing, but also substances that could not be readily identified. Some appeared to be plant material from species that did not grow in the local area, while others resembled metal fragments that had been subjected to extreme heat. Most puzzling of all were traces of a waxy substance that produced a distinctly sweet odor when heated, a smell that several searchers described as simultaneously attractive and deeply unsettling. Even more disturbing was the discovery of clothing fragments caught on branches along what might have been a path leading away from the campsite. The scraps of fabric matched descriptions of garments owned by the Holloway family, but they were found scattered across several miles of rough terrain with no discernible pattern. Some pieces hung from branches 20 feet above the ground, as if they had been placed there deliberately or torn away by something capable of flight. The fabric showed signs of having been subjected to forces that defied easy explanation. Rather than the ragged tears that would result from catching on thorns or sharp branches, the cloth appeared to have been cut with surgical precision. The edges were smooth and clean, showing none of the fraying that would normally occur when fabric is ripped away forcefully. Some pieces showed burn marks similar to those found in the cabin, but without any corresponding damage to the surrounding vegetation. As the search efforts continued into the spring of 1887, they began to reveal patterns that suggested the Holloway disappearance was not an isolated incident. Investigators discovered evidence of other unexplained vanishings in the region, cases that had been dismissed as accidents or attributed to natural causes, but which showed disturbing similarities to the Holloway case. The Garrett family had disappeared from their homestead in Devil's Den Hollow in the spring of 1885, leaving behind a scene nearly identical to what searchers found at the Holloway cabin. Like the Holloways, the Garretts had vanished without taking their winter clothing or personal valuables, and their livestock had been found alive but distressed after several days without care. The local sheriff's report on the Garrett case, filed away and forgotten until the Holloway investigation brought it to light, described the same mysterious burn marks, the same precisely arranged personal belongings, and the same complete absence of any logical explanation. 3 other families had vanished under similar circumstances over the previous decade, all within a 20-mile radius of the Holloway homestead. The Patterson clan had disappeared in 1878, the McKinneys in 1881, and the Thorntons in 1883. In each case, investigators found empty cabins with meals half prepared, fires that continued burning long after they should have died out, and personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate organization rather than hasty departure. What made these discoveries even more unsettling was the realization that the disappearances seemed to follow a temporal pattern. They occurred at roughly 3-year intervals, always during the late winter months when travel was most difficult and outside contact was minimal. The locations formed a rough circle around what locals had long considered to be a cursed area, a region of deep hollows and ancient caves that even the most experienced mountain men avoided after sunset. This area, known in Cherokee tradition as the Nightland, was said to be a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of spirits grew dangerously thin. According to tribal legends passed down through generations, it was here that the Cherokee had once conducted their most sacred and dangerous ceremonies, rituals designed to communicate with the dead, predict the future, and harness supernatural forces for both healing and warfare. The forced removal of the Cherokee from the Arkansas Territory in the 1830s had disrupted these ancient practices, but tribal elders insisted that the spiritual energies concentrated in the Nightland remained active and dangerous. They warned that white settlers who built their homes too close to these sacred areas risked attracting the attention of entities that viewed all human presence as an intrusion to be eliminated. As winter gave way to spring, and the search efforts expanded beyond the immediate area around the Holloway homestead, teams of volunteers began to encounter phenomena that challenged their understanding of the natural world. Experienced hunters reported finding areas where animal life seemed completely absent. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no small mammals scurrying through the underbrush. These zones of unnatural quiet often coincided with clearings where nothing grew, despite soil that appeared fertile and conditions that should have supported lush vegetation. Compass needles spun wildly in these locations, making navigation impossible and forcing search parties to rely on landmarks that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles. Several experienced woodsmen reported feeling watched by invisible presences that made the hair on their necks stand on end and filled them with an overwhelming urge to flee the area as quickly as possible. Temperature measurements taken in these mysterious zones showed readings that defied meteorological explanation. While surrounding areas experienced normal seasonal warming as spring progressed, the cleared spaces remained locked in perpetual winter, with ground that stayed frozen despite direct sunlight and air temperatures that dropped 20 degrees below ambient levels without any identifiable cause. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that searchers began to report. Voices calling from deep within the forest, speaking words in languages that no one could identify. Sometimes these voices seemed to be calling the names of the missing Holloway family members, while at other times they spoke in what sounded like Cherokee or other Native American tongues. Recording equipment brought in from Little Rock captured some of these vocalizations, but playback revealed only static and electronic interference that made analysis impossible. The psychological toll on the search parties became increasingly evident as the weeks passed. Men who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness began experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and episodes of disorientation that left them unable to function effectively. Several volunteers quit the search entirely, claiming that they could no longer tolerate the feelings of dread and paranoia that seemed to intensify the closer they came to solving the mystery. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a physician and amateur anthropologist from the University of Arkansas, joined the investigation in April of 1887, hoping to apply scientific methods to what had become an increasingly supernatural puzzle. His detailed journal, discovered in university archives decades later, provides a fascinating account of his attempts to find rational explanations for the phenomena surrounding the Holloway case. Blackwood's initial approach was methodically skeptical. He attributed the mysterious burn marks to unusual mineral deposits in the soil that might have caused spontaneous combustion under certain atmospheric conditions. The preserved condition of the meal in the cabin could be explained by the extreme cold and low humidity of the mountain winter. Even the strange behavior of the search dogs might have rational causes. Unusual scent patterns created by decomposing organic matter or mineral springs that interfered with the animals' sensitive olfactory systems. But as Blackwood spent more time investigating the disappearance sites, his scientific confidence began to waver. His instruments detected electromagnetic anomalies that had no known natural cause, temperature variations that violated basic principles of thermodynamics, and gravitational fluctuations that suggested the presence of massive underground structures or voids that geological surveys had failed to identify. Most troubling to the scientist were his own experiences during overnight stays at the investigation sites. Blackwood prided himself on his rational skepticism and his immunity to the superstitious fears that affected less educated individuals. Yet he found himself experiencing vivid hallucinations, auditory phenomena that his equipment could not record, and episodes of lost time where hours would pass without his awareness or memory of what had occurred. His journal entries from this period show a gradual transformation from confident scientific inquiry to barely controlled terror. "I came here to debunk mountain superstition with the tools of modern science," he wrote in his final entry, dated May 15, 1887. "Instead, I find myself confronting realities that science cannot explain and forces that human understanding was never meant to comprehend. I am leaving this investigation before it claims another victim. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. As months passed without any definitive answers, the Holloway disappearance began to take on a life of its own within the broader community. What had started as a local tragedy gradually transformed into something larger, a story that spread far beyond the Ozark Mountains and began to attract attention from newspaper reporters, curiosity seekers, and self-proclaimed experts in supernatural phenomena from across the country. The first published account appeared in the Arkansas Gazette in May of 1887, under the sensational headline, "Entire Family Vanishes Without Trace in Ozark Wilderness." The article, written by a reporter who had never actually visited the scene, was filled with lurid speculation and barely contained implications of supernatural involvement. While local residents resented the outsiders' interpretation of their tragedy, they could not deny that the basic facts were as impossible as any work of fiction. The Gazette story was picked up by newspapers throughout the region, each adding new details or theories that may or may not have had any basis in reality. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch claimed that the Holloways had been seen in distant towns, living under assumed names and refusing to explain their sudden departure from their mountain home. The Memphis Commercial Appeal suggested that Ezra had discovered gold on his property and that the family had been murdered by claim jumpers who had since made off with their fortune. These published stories, in turn, began to attract visitors to the abandoned Holloway homestead. Some came seeking treasure, convinced that the family had hidden valuables before their disappearance, and that careful searching might reveal the location of their cache. Others arrived with equipment for detecting supernatural phenomena, hoping to document evidence of ghostly activity or otherworldly intervention that might explain the mysterious vanishing. A few visitors were simply drawn by morbid curiosity, wanting to see for themselves the place where an entire family had simply ceased to exist. These tourists brought their own problems. They disturbed potential evidence, spread rumors based on misunderstood observations, and sometimes failed to return from their explorations, adding new disappearances to the growing tally of unexplained vanishings in the area. But the mountain folk themselves began to avoid the Holloway property entirely, treating it as a place of power and danger that was best left undisturbed. Even the most practical and skeptical among them admitted to feeling uneasy whenever their travels took them near the empty cabin. The building itself seemed to radiate a sense of wrongness that affected both humans and animals in ways that defied rational explanation. Horses would refuse to approach within a certain distance of the homestead, becoming increasingly agitated and difficult to control as they were forced closer to the abandoned buildings. Hunting dogs would whine and cower rather than follow scent trails that led toward the site, and even the most aggressive farm animals became docile and withdrawn after spending time in the area. Local children were strictly forbidden from playing anywhere near the former Holloway property, and adults who had business in the surrounding area made sure to complete their tasks well before sunset. Stories began to circulate of lights seen moving through the empty rooms at night, of voices heard calling from within the walls, and of figures glimpsed briefly in the windows, before vanishing when approached for a closer look. The abandoned cabin became a focal point for the region's collective unease about the disappearance, but it also served as a kind of monument to the family that had once lived there. Neighbors took turns maintaining the property, repairing storm damage, and keeping the structure from falling into complete decay. They spoke of this work as a duty owed to the missing Holloways, a way of keeping faith that someday the family might return to reclaim their home. As the years passed, the Holloway mystery became woven into the fabric of Ozark folklore, joining the countless other tales of supernatural encounters and unexplained phenomena that had accumulated over generations of mountain living. Parents used the story to warn children about the dangers of wandering too far from home after dark, Young couples told the tale to frighten each other during evening walks, finding excitement in shared fear that brought them closer together. But the story also evolved in the telling, accumulating new details and variations that reflected the fears and beliefs of each generation. Some versions claimed that the Holloways had been taken by vengeful Cherokee spirits as punishment for settling on sacred land. Others suggested that Margaret's healing abilities had attracted the attention of otherworldly entities who had claimed the entire family as payment for supernatural knowledge that mortals were not meant to possess. A particularly persistent version of the tale held that the family had not vanished at all, but had been transformed into something inhuman and were still living in the deep caves beneath the mountains. According to this variation, they could sometimes be seen on moonless nights, wandering through the forest with glowing eyes and skin that had taken on the pale luminescence of cave-dwelling creatures. These sightings were always brief and distant, leaving witnesses uncertain whether they had seen anything at all or merely imagined shapes in the darkness. In the early 1900s, as automobiles and telephone lines began to connect the Ozark Mountains to the wider world, a new generation of investigators arrived to examine the Holloway case with the tools and perspectives of the modern age. These researchers brought scientific methods and rational skepticism to bear on the old mystery, but their findings only served to deepen the puzzle rather than resolve it. A team from the University of Arkansas conducted the first systematic archaeological survey of the Holloway homestead in 1923. Using techniques that had been developed for studying ancient Native American sites throughout the region, their excavations revealed several anomalies in the soil composition around the cabin, including areas where the earth seemed to have been subjected to extreme heat, despite no evidence of fire having occurred above ground. The archaeologists also discovered metal fragments buried at various depths throughout the property, pieces of iron and steel that showed signs of having been twisted and melted by forces far beyond anything that should have existed in a 19th-century mountain homestead. Some fragments appeared to be parts of tools or household implements, but others resembled no known objects and seemed to have been created by some process that left them partially fused with the surrounding soil. Most intriguing of all was the discovery of what appeared to be a structured foundation buried several feet beneath the cabin floor. This foundation was constructed of stones that matched no local geological formations and were arranged in patterns that suggested sophisticated engineering knowledge. The stones themselves showed signs of having been worked by tools more precise than anything available to frontier settlers, with perfectly straight cuts and surfaces that had been polished to mirror smoothness. Carbon dating of organic material found in association with this buried foundation suggested that it predated European settlement of the area by several centuries. Yet the construction techniques appeared to be more advanced than those used by known Native American cultures in the region. The archaeologists were forced to conclude that some unknown civilization had once occupied the site, leaving behind evidence of technological capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of pre-Columbian American history. Paranormal investigators, armed with the latest electromagnetic detection equipment, reported readings that defied conventional scientific explanation. Photographic plates exposed in the cabin showed strange light patterns and shadowy figures that had not been visible to the naked eye during the exposure. Temperature measurements revealed localized cold spots that persist, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal changes, maintaining temperatures 20 to 30 degrees below ambient levels without any identifiable energy source. Electronic equipment brought to the site frequently malfunctioned in ways that suggested interference from powerful electromagnetic fields. Yet no source for such fields could be identified. Compasses spun wildly. Radio communications became impossible, and even mechanical devices like pocket watches and wind-up clocks began keeping erratic time when brought onto the property. Recording equipment captured sounds that human ears could not detect, subsonic vibrations that seemed to emanate from deep underground, electromagnetic pulses that occurred in regular patterns suggesting some form of artificial generation, and audio frequencies that, when played back at reduced speed, resembled human voices speaking in unknown languages. Dr. Margaret Foster, a researcher from the Institute for Psychical Research in New York, spent 3 months investigating the Holloway case in 1934, hoping to apply the latest theories about extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena to the decades-old mystery. Her detailed report, published in the Journal of Parapsychology in 1935, documented a series of experiences that challenged even her considerable expertise in supernatural investigations. Foster reported sensing the presence of multiple human consciousness in the abandoned cabin, emotional imprints that seemed to be embedded in the very structure of the building. These impressions conveyed feelings of sudden terror, desperate confusion, and overwhelming compulsion to follow something or someone into the darkness outside. Most disturbing of all were the recurring images of a figure she described as neither fully human nor entirely inhuman, something that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some other dimension of reality. Her attempts to communicate with these residual consciousness produced fragmented messages that spoke of being called by the deep voices, of following lights that led into passages beneath the earth, and of discovering the place where time bends back upon itself. These communications were often interrupted by periods of interference that Foster described as feeling like the presence of something vast and ancient that considers human consciousness to be an irritating intrusion into its domain. Yet despite decades of investigation using increasingly sophisticated methods, the basic questions surrounding the Holloway disappearance remained unanswered. Modern researchers could document the anomalies and catalog the unexplained phenomena associated with the case, but they could not explain how or why an entire family had vanished without leaving a single definitive clue about their fate. The introduction of advanced forensic techniques in the 1950s and 1960s brought new hope for solving the mystery, but these methods only uncovered additional puzzles. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the existence of vast underground chambers beneath the Holloway property, spaces that appeared to extend for miles through the mountain bedrock in patterns that suggested artificial construction rather than natural cave formation. Spectrographic analysis of the mysterious burn marks found throughout the cabin identified traces of elements that did not occur naturally in the Earth's atmosphere, substances that seemed to require artificial creation under laboratory conditions that would not be developed until the late 20th century. How these exotic materials had come to be present in a remote mountain cabin in 1887 remained completely inexplicable. DNA analysis of hair and tissue samples preserved from the original investigation confirmed that they had indeed come from the Holloway F.A. Millie members, but also revealed genetic markers that suggested exposure to high levels of radiation, a phenomenon that should have been impossible decades before the discovery of radioactivity and the development of nuclear technology. As we move into the modern era and consider the various theories that have been proposed over more than a century of investigation, murder, flight, natural disaster, supernatural intervention, alien abduction, interdimensional travel, we are forced to confront the possibility that some mysteries may be genuinely unsolvable using conventional methods of inquiry. The Holloway case resists every attempt to force it into the comfortable categories of rational explanation. It exists in that twilight realm between documented fact and inexplicable phenomenon, challenging our assumptions about what is possible in our orderly, rational world and suggesting that reality may be far stranger and more complex than our scientific models can accommodate. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Holloway mystery is not the disappearance itself, but what it suggests about the nature of reality in places where civilization's grip grows thin. The Ozark Mountains in 1887 were a frontier in more ways than one. Not just geographically, but metaphysically, a place where the normal rules might not always apply, and where things could happen that had no place in the daylight world of cause and effect. The pattern of disappearances that emerged from the investigation suggests that the Holloway case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger phenomenon that has been operating in the region for generations. The 3-year cycle, the geographical clustering around the area known as the Nightland, and the consistent details found at each disappearance site all point to some form of recurring event that follows its own mysterious logic. Recent investigations using satellite imagery and computer modeling have revealed additional disturbing patterns. The locations of the documented disappearances, when plotted on topographical maps, form geometric shapes that correspond to astronomical alignments occurring at the time of each vanishing. The underground chamber systems detected by ground-penetrating radar appear to connect all of the sites in a network that extends far beyond the borders of Arkansas into the neighboring states. Most significantly, the pattern of disappearances has continued into the modern era. Families and individuals continue to vanish from the same general area at regular intervals, their cases often dismissed as ordinary missing persons reports or attributed to more mundane explanations. But careful analysis reveals the same signature elements that characterize the Holloway case: empty homes with meals half prepared, personal belongings left behind, and complete absence of any trail to follow. The Holloway family walked into history on that winter night more than a century ago, leaving behind only questions and an empty cabin that refuses to give up its secrets. Their disappearance serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some silences are not meant to be broken, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The empty cabin still stands today, weathered by more than a century of seasons, but refusing to collapse into the comfortable decay that claims most abandoned structures. Park rangers and local authorities have attempted to demolish the building several times over the years, but their efforts have been consistently thwarted by equipment failures, accidents, and bureaucratic complications that seem to arise whenever destruction is attempted. Visitors continue to report strange experiences there. Electronic devices that all function without explanation, photographs that reveal details invisible to the human eye, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen presences that seem to follow them long after they leave the property. The area has been designated as a historic site and incorporated into a state park, but rangers admit that they prefer to conduct their patrols during daylight hours and avoid the cabin itself whenever possible. Whatever happened to Ezra, Margaret, Samuel, Mary, and little Thomas Holloway on that February night in 1887, their story has become something larger than a simple missing persons case. It has become a reminder that despite all our scientific advances and rational certainties, there remain corners of the world where mystery still reigns supreme, where questions outnumber answers, and where the impossible might just be waiting for the right moment to reveal itself as terrifyingly real. In the end, we are left with the chilling reality that somewhere in the Ozark Mountains, beneath the ancient trees and beside the flowing streams, the truth about the Holloway family waits in the darkness. Whether that truth involves human violence, natural disaster, or something far stranger than either, it remains hidden in the shadows, as elusive as the family whose fate it holds. And perhaps, on quiet mountain nights, when the wind carries whispers through the hollows, that silence itself becomes the most eloquent testimony to mysteries that surpass human understanding. The Holloway case reminds us that even in our modern world of satellite surveillance and DNA analysis, there remain places where people can simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and the haunting echo of lives interrupted by forces beyond our comprehension. Their story continues to resonate because it touches something primal in our collective consciousness. The fear that despite all our technology and civilization, we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our understanding or control. In an age where we believe we have mapped every corner of the earth and explained every natural phenomenon, the Holloway disappearance stands as a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. And so the mystery endures, passed down through generations like a dark inheritance, challenging each new listener to confront the possibility that some questions have no answers, some disappearances have no explanation, and some nights in the deep woods hold secrets that were never meant for human understanding. The Holloway family may be gone, but their story lives on, a permanent reminder that the world still holds wonders and terrors that exist just beyond the reach of our certainty.